Miranda Caldwell drove her shiny red sports car down the busy streets of Boston. The 34-year-old woman had perfect blonde hair, designer clothes, and a smile that could charm anyone. Behind that smile was a person who didn't think rules applied to her. From a young age, Miranda got everything she wanted. Her father owned 3 big companies in the city. Her mother came from old money. Together, they gave Miranda a life of luxury and privilege. As a child, Miranda attended Westfield Academy, the most expensive private school in the state. When she broke school rules, her parents made donations, and the problems went away. In college at Princeton, the pattern continued. Party too loud. Pay the fine. Miss too many classes. Family connections fixed it. Now, as an adult, Miranda worked at her father's marketing company. She had a big office with a view, but rarely showed up before 10 a.m. Her coworkers did most of her work while she took credit. Nobody said anything because they knew she was the boss's daughter. Traffic laws were just another set of rules Miranda ignored. She parked in no parking zones, ran yellow lights, and always drove at least 15 miles over the speed limit. When she got tickets, she tossed them on her assistant's desk and forgot about them. "Take care of these," she would say with a wave of her manicured hand. Her assistant, Jenny, would sigh and call Miranda's lawyer, who made the tickets disappear like magic. This happened so often that Jenny had the lawyer on speed dial. On Tuesday morning, Miranda woke up late. She had been at a party until 3 a.m. and had a meeting at 9 a.m. Without time for breakfast, she rushed to her car in a bad mood. As she sped down Commonwealth Avenue, her phone buzzed with a text. "Where are you?" Her father had written. "The clients are waiting." Miranda typed a reply with one hand while steering with the other. She didn't notice her speed climbing to 60 miles per hour in a 35 miles per hour zone. She also didn't notice the police car parked on the side of the road until its lights flashed behind her. "Not today," Miranda muttered, pulling over with an annoyed sigh. Officer Tom Rodriguez approached her car window. This was his 10th year on the force. He had seen all types of drivers, but something about Miranda's bored expression made him take special notice. "License and registration, please," he said politely. Miranda didn't look up from her phone. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, still typing. "No, ma'am, I need your license and registration." She rolled her eyes and reached for her designer purse. "This is such a waste of time. I'm late for an important meeting." Officer Rodriguez noted several things: the smell of alcohol from the night before, Miranda's bloodshot eyes, and an open coffee mug that didn't just contain coffee. "Ma'am, have you been drinking this morning?" Miranda finally looked at him, her face showing surprise that quickly turned to anger. "I'm Miranda Caldwell. My father is James Caldwell. Look him up." Officer Rodriguez remained professional. "I need you to step out of the car, please." "This is ridiculous," she said, but opened her door. "My lawyer will have this dismissed by lunchtime." As she stepped out, Miranda stumbled slightly. The officer noticed. He had seen entitled behavior before, but Miranda took it to another level. She genuinely believed she was untouchable. Little did Miranda know, this traffic stop would be different from all the others. This time, her actions would have real consequences, and her life was about to change forever. Officer Rodriguez stood patiently as Miranda fumbled with her phone, trying to call someone important. The morning sun reflected off his badge while cars passed by slowly, drivers curious about the fancy sports car pulled over. "Ma'am, I need you to focus on our conversation," Officer Rodriguez said firmly. "Please put your phone away." Miranda glared at him. "Do you know how much money my family donates to the police fund each year?" The officer didn't react to her comment. Instead, he took out a small device from his pocket. "I need you to take a breathalyzer test." "Absolutely not," Miranda snapped. "I know my rights." Officer Rodriguez sighed. He had dealt with difficult people before, but Miranda was testing his patience. "In that case, I'll need you to perform some simple sobriety tests." Miranda stood on the sidewalk in her expensive high heels, swaying slightly. The officer asked her to walk in a straight line, touch her nose with her finger, and follow his pen with her eyes without moving her head. She failed all 3 tests. "This is harassment," she said loudly, hoping someone would hear. "I'm perfectly fine to drive." Just then, a small blue car pulled up behind the police car. A woman with a camera got out quickly. "Great," muttered Officer Rodriguez. It was Samantha Wells from the local news. She was known for recording police interactions, sometimes catching bad behavior, at other times just making officers' jobs harder. "Is everything okay here?" Samantha called out, camera already recording. Miranda saw an opportunity. "Thank goodness you're here. This officer is harassing me for no reason." Officer Rodriguez remained calm. "Ma'am, please step back. This is a police matter." But Miranda had an audience now, and she became more dramatic. "I was just driving to work, and he pulled me over because he doesn't like my car. Probably jealous." Samantha moved closer, her camera capturing everything. "Officer, can you comment on why you stopped this woman?" Before he could answer, Miranda tried to walk back to her car. She stumbled badly, nearly falling. The camera caught it all. "Ma'am, you can't drive in your condition," Officer Rodriguez said, moving to block her path. "Don't touch me," Miranda yelled, though the officer hadn't tried to. She raised her hand as if to push him away. Officer Rodriguez stepped back. "Ma'am, if you touch an officer, that's assault." "You can't arrest me," Miranda laughed, but her voice shook a little. "My father will have your job by dinner time." Samantha kept filming as Officer Rodriguez calmly took out his handcuffs. "Miranda Caldwell, you're under arrest for driving under the influence, resisting an officer, and threatening an officer." For the first time, real fear showed on Miranda's face. This wasn't going according to her plan. Usually, mentioning her father's name was enough to get out of trouble. "You can't be serious," she said, looking around as if expecting someone to stop this. As Officer Rodriguez read Miranda her rights, Samantha captured it all on camera. The story of a wealthy woman's arrest would make the evening news for sure. Inside Miranda's car, Officer Rodriguez found 3 empty mini bottles of expensive vodka, a prescription bottle with someone else's name, and her cell phone showing 5 missed calls from her father. When the tow truck arrived to take Miranda's car away, she was sitting in the back of the police car, mascara running down her face. The reality of her situation was finally sinking in. "My father will sue the entire police department," she said through tears. Officer Rodriguez just nodded and started driving toward the station. He had heard such threats before. What Miranda didn't know was that her father was watching her arrest live on the local news website, streaming from Samantha's camera, and he wasn't making any calls to help her this time. The police station was busy that morning. Officers walked quickly between desks with coffee cups and papers. Phones rang constantly. Miranda sat on a hard plastic chair near the front desk, still in handcuffs. Her designer dress was wrinkled, and her makeup was smeared under her eyes. "I get one phone call," Miranda said loudly to no one in particular. "I know my rights." Officer Rodriguez was filling out paperwork at a nearby desk. "Yes, you'll get your call soon." Miranda looked around the station with disgust. She had never been inside a police station before. The bright lights hurt her eyes. The smell of cheap coffee and cleaning products made her feel sick. Or maybe that was the alcohol still in her system. "Process her," said Sergeant Wilson, a tall woman with short gray hair. She handed Officer Rodriguez a clipboard. "Booking room 2 is open." Miranda was led to a small room with a camera in the corner. Officer Rodriguez took her fingerprints, pressing each finger onto an electronic scanner. Then he stood her against a wall with height markers and took her photo. "This is ridiculous," Miranda said. "My lawyer will have this thrown out immediately." The officer didn't respond. He had heard such comments many times before. A female officer named Garcia came in to search Miranda. "Remove your jewelry and empty your pockets, please." Miranda reluctantly took off her diamond earrings and expensive watch. She placed her designer wallet on the table. "You have no idea how much these cost," she snapped. "If anything goes missing, I'll sue." Officer Garcia just nodded and continued with her job. Finally, Miranda was allowed her phone call. She dialed her father's number, certain he would fix everything. The phone rang 4 times before he answered. "Dad, you need to help me," she said quickly. "I'm at the downtown police station. They arrested me for no reason. Send Jeffrey right away." Jeffrey was the family lawyer who had fixed her previous tickets. There was a long silence on the other end. "Dad? Are you there?" "I saw the news, Miranda," her father said coldly. "It's all over the internet. You were clearly drunk at 9 in the morning. You threatened a police officer. On camera." Miranda's face went pale. But, no, her father interrupted. Not this time. For years, I've cleaned up your messes. I paid your tickets. I've called in favors. And what have you learned? Nothing. Daddy, please, Miranda whispered, her voice shaking. You need to face the consequences of your actions for once, he said firmly. Jeffrey won't be coming. The call ended with a click. Miranda stood frozen, still holding the phone. This wasn't supposed to happen. Her father always fixed things. Always. Officer Rodriguez watched as Miranda slowly put down the phone. Her hand was shaking. Is your lawyer coming? He asked, though he had heard enough to know the answer. Miranda didn't respond. She just stared at the floor, her entire world changing around her. You'll see a judge tomorrow morning, Officer Rodriguez explained. Until then, you'll stay in a holding cell. As they walked toward the cells, Miranda passed a TV in the break room. On the screen was her own face, looking angry and disheveled as she yelled at Officer Rodriguez. The headline read, Prominent businessman's daughter arrested for DUI. In the holding cell, Miranda sat on a thin mattress. The cell was small, with just a toilet in the corner and a small sink. She wasn't alone. 2 other women were there, an older woman sleeping in the corner and a young woman about Miranda's age. First time? The young woman asked. Miranda didn't answer. She couldn't believe this was happening. The first night is the hardest, the woman continued. I'm Lisa, by the way. Miranda turned away, facing the wall. She had never felt so alone, so powerless. For the first time in her life, her name and her father's money couldn't help her. And somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe she deserved this. Miranda woke up with a stiff neck and a pounding headache. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Her bed felt hard, and the room smelled strange. Then she opened her eyes and remembered. She was in a holding cell at the police station. Light came through a small window high on the wall. It must be morning, Miranda thought. She had spent the whole night here. The 2 other women were still asleep. Miranda sat up slowly and looked at her hands. Her perfect manicure was chipped, and her fingers were still stained with ink from the fingerprinting. A police officer appeared at the cell door. Caldwell, time to get ready. You're seeing the judge in an hour. Miranda stood up, her legs shaky. Can I make another call? The officer nodded and led her to the phone. This time, Miranda called her assistant, Jenny. Jenny, I need you to bring me some clean clothes, Miranda said quickly. I'm at the downtown police station, and bring my makeup bag. There was silence on the other end. Jenny, do you hear me? Yes, Ms. Caldwell, Jenny said quietly. But I can't come. Your father called this morning, and I don't work for you anymore. Miranda felt like someone had punched her. What do you mean? He fired me for helping you cover up your previous tickets. I'm sorry, but I can't help you now. The line went dead. Miranda stood there in shock. Her father had fired Jenny? That seemed impossible. And now she had no one to bring her clothes. She would have to face the judge looking like this, messy hair, wrinkled dress, and day-old makeup. An hour later, Miranda sat in a small room with about 20 other people waiting to see the judge. Some wore orange jumpsuits. Others, like her, still wore the clothes they were arrested in. Everyone looked tired and worried. A public defender, a young man named David Kim, sat next to her with a stack of papers. Since you don't have private representation, I'll be your attorney today, he explained, not looking up from his notes. I don't need a public defender, Miranda said coldly. My family has lawyers. David looked at her with tired eyes. None of them are here, Ms. Caldwell, and you're seeing the judge in 10 minutes, so I suggest we work together. Miranda wanted to argue but felt too exhausted. Fine. What's going to happen? You're charged with DUI, resisting arrest, and verbally threatening an officer, David said. It's your first DUI offense, but the video of your arrest is not helpful to your case. The judge will set bail and schedule your next court date. Bail? Miranda asked. How much? Depends on the judge. Could be a few $1,000s. Miranda relaxed a little. A few thousand was nothing to her family. But then she remembered her father's words on the phone. Would he even pay her bail? Caldwell, Miranda, called a court officer. You're up. The courtroom was small but formal. American flags stood on both sides of the judge's bench, About a dozen people sat in the audience, some family members of other defendants, some lawyers waiting for their cases. To Miranda's horror, she also saw Samantha Wells, the reporter from yesterday, sitting in the back with her camera ready. Judge Helen Martinez looked at Miranda over her glasses. She was an older woman with gray hair and a serious face. She had been a judge for 20 years and had seen every type of defendant. Miss Caldwell, you are charged with driving under the influence, resisting arrest, and threatening a police officer. How do you plead? David stood up. Not guilty, Your Honor. Judge Martinez looked at Miranda directly. Miss Caldwell, based on the evidence in the video recording, I'm setting your bail at $15,000. Miranda gasped. That was much more than she expected. Your next court date is 3 weeks from today. If you cannot post bail, you will remain in county jail until then. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Miranda stood frozen as the reality hit her. She was going to jail unless someone paid her bail. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure anyone would come to her rescue. 3 weeks passed slowly for Miranda. Her father had paid her bail, but he hadn't come to see her. He sent a message through his secretary. You're on your own this time. Now Miranda sat in the hallway outside courtroom 4, dressed in a simple black suit she had bought for the occasion. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry. Her lawyer had advised her to look serious and respectful. But this lawyer wasn't Jeffrey, her father's expensive attorney who had fixed her previous tickets. This was Alan Morris, a court-appointed lawyer who seemed too busy and too tired. He carried a worn briefcase and had coffee stains on his tie. Remember what we discussed, Alan said, checking his watch. Be polite. Say, yes, Your Honor, and no, Your Honor. Don't argue or try to explain unless I tell you to. Miranda nodded. The past 3 weeks had changed her. She had lost her job at her father's company. Her so-called friends hadn't returned her calls. Her apartment building had sent a notice that her lease wouldn't be renewed because of behavior concerns. The courtroom doors opened, and a court officer called her name. Miranda took a deep breath and walked in. The room was larger than she expected, with dark wood panels and rows of seats. Most were empty, but she spotted the reporter, Samantha Wells, sitting in the back row. But there was someone else too. Officer Rodriguez sat near the front, in his full uniform. Their eyes met briefly, and Miranda quickly looked away. All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Watson, announced the court officer. Everyone stood as the judge entered. Judge Watson was not what Miranda expected. She was younger than Judge Martinez, maybe in her 40s, with short brown hair and sharp eyes. She moved efficiently, taking her seat and putting on reading glasses in one smooth motion. Case number 2473, State versus Miranda Caldwell, the court clerk announced. Judge Watson looked at the papers before her. Miss Caldwell, you are charged with driving under the influence, resisting arrest, and threatening a police officer. Your lawyer entered a not guilty plea at your arraignment. Is that still your plea? Alan stood up. Your Honor, my client would like to change her plea to guilty. This was their strategy. Alan had explained that with the video evidence, fighting the charges would only make things worse. A guilty plea might get her a lighter sentence. Very well, Judge Watson said. Before I accept your plea, Miss Caldwell, I want to make sure you understand the charges against you and the possible consequences. The judge explained that Miranda could face up to 6 months in jail, heavy fines, and loss of her driver's license. Miranda listened, her stomach tight with fear. Do you still wish to plead guilty? The judge asked. Yes, Your Honor, Miranda said, her voice smaller than she intended. The prosecutor, a young woman named Sarah Chen, presented the case. She showed the video from Samantha's camera and from Officer Rodriguez's body camera. The videos were even worse than Miranda remembered. She watched herself stumble, yell, and threaten the officer. She looked like a completely different person, angry, entitled, and clearly drunk. Officer Rodriguez testified next, describing Miranda's behavior calmly and professionally. He didn't exaggerate or add any personal comments. He simply stated the facts. Officer Rodriguez, Judge Watson asked, has Ms. Caldwell shown any remorse for her actions? The officer glanced at Miranda. Not during our interaction, Your Honor. She was mostly concerned about her connections and how quickly she could get the charges dropped. Miranda felt her face burn with shame. It was all true. When it was her turn to speak, Miranda stood on shaky legs. "Miss Caldwell, do you have anything to say before I determine your sentence?" Judge Watson asked. Miranda looked up at the judge. 3 weeks ago, she would have made excuses or tried to charm her way out of trouble. But now, facing the evidence of her behavior, she had nothing to hide behind. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said simply. "I was wrong." Judge Watson's expression didn't change. She had heard many apologies in this courtroom. The question was Miranda truly sorry, or just sorry she got caught? The courtroom was quiet as Judge Watson considered Miranda's case. The only sounds were the soft clicking of the court reporter's keyboard and the occasional cough from the audience. Miranda stood still, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Judge Watson looked through the papers one last time, then set them down and removed her glasses. She looked directly at Miranda. "Miss Caldwell," she began, her voice firm but not unkind. "I have reviewed your case carefully. I've watched the videos, read the police report, and considered your guilty plea." Miranda nodded slightly, her mouth dry. "I've also reviewed your driving record," the judge continued. "This was not an isolated incident. You have a pattern of traffic violations that have mysteriously disappeared. 7 speeding tickets in the past year alone. 3 red light violations. 2 parking infractions in emergency vehicle zones." Miranda felt her face grow hot. She hadn't known the judge would see all of that. In each case, the charges were dropped or reduced to almost nothing. "It seems you've developed a belief that rules simply don't apply to you." From the corner of her eye, Miranda could see Samantha writing quickly in her notebook. Tomorrow, all of Boston would read about this. "What concerns me most," Judge Watson said, leaning forward slightly, "is not just your dangerous driving, but your attitude toward authority and the law itself. Your threats to Officer Rodriguez show a deep disrespect for our legal system." The judge paused, and the silence felt heavy in the room. Officer Rodriguez sat still, his expression professional and neutral. "Stand for your sentence, Miss Caldwell," the judge instructed. Miranda stood straighter, her legs feeling weak. "For the charge of driving under the influence, I sentence you to 30 days in county jail. For resisting arrest, 15 days to be served concurrently. For threatening an officer, 10 days, also concurrent." Miranda felt dizzy. Jail, real jail, not just a holding cell, for 30 days. "Additionally, your driver's license is suspended for 1 year. You will pay a fine of $5,000, and you will complete 200 hours of community service at the Highway Safety Education Center, speaking to high school students about the dangers of drunk driving." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Miranda jump. "Court officers will take you into custody now to begin your sentence," Judge Watson said. "I hope this experience teaches you that in this courtroom, and in this country, no one is above the law." 2 court officers approached Miranda. One carried handcuffs. May I say something, Your Honor?" Miranda asked quickly. The judge nodded once. "I understand now," Miranda said, her voice shaking. "I was wrong, not just about driving drunk, but about everything. I thought I was special, that rules were for other people. I see now how dangerous that was." Judge Watson's expression softened slightly. "I'm glad to hear that, Ms. Caldwell. But understanding is just the first step. Real change comes through actions, not words. Perhaps after 30 days of reflection, we'll have a clearer perspective." As the court officers placed the handcuffs on Miranda's wrists, she didn't resist. She didn't argue or threaten. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she accepted the consequences of her actions. Her lawyer gathered his papers with a sigh. He had expected this outcome, though he hadn't told Miranda how likely jail time was. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. As Miranda was led out through a side door, she passed Officer Rodriguez. Their eyes met briefly. There was no anger in his face, no satisfaction at her punishment, just the steady gaze of a man doing his job, upholding the law that applied to everyone equally. The heavy door closed behind Miranda with a final sounding thud. Her old life of privilege and exception was over. Her 30 days of reality were about to begin. And somewhere in the back of the courtroom, Samantha Wells finished her notes and closed her notebook. She had her headline: Judge Yeshua Cal de Liel Harris, no one is above the law. County jail was nothing like Miranda had seen in movies. There were no dramatic fights or dangerous criminals threatening her. Instead, it was boring, uncomfortable, and strict. The walls were plain beige, the food was bland, and the schedule was the same every day. Miranda's cell was small with 2 metal beds, a metal toilet, and a small sink. Her cellmate was a woman named Tanya, who was serving 60 days for shoplifting food for her children. On Miranda's first night, she cried silently in her bed. She missed her soft mattress, her expensive sheets, and her spacious apartment. The jail bed was hard, the blanket was scratchy, and the lights in the hallway never completely turned off. "First week is the hardest," Tanya said from the other bed. "It gets easier." Miranda didn't answer. She didn't want to talk to criminals. But as days passed, Miranda had no choice but to talk to Tanya. They shared the small space, ate at the same times, and followed the same rules. Slowly, Miranda learned about Tanya's life. How she lost her job when the factory closed. How she couldn't pay rent and feed her kids at the same time. How she made one desperate mistake. "Why didn't you just ask your parents for help?" Miranda asked one day during lunch in the cafeteria. Tanya laughed without humor. "Not everyone has parents with money, Miranda. My mom died when I was 14. My dad left when I was 3. Miranda had never thought about that before. In her world, everyone had safety nets. During her second week, Miranda joined the jail's work program. She folded laundry for 8 hours a day. The work was simple but tiring. Her soft hands developed calluses. Her manicured nails broke. By evening, her back ached from standing all day. "Good job today," said Rosa, an older woman who had been in jail for 6 months. "You're getting faster." Miranda felt a strange sense of pride. No one had ever praised her for actual work before. At her father's company, people complimented her clothes or her parties, never her job performance. In the third week, Miranda started attending the jail's education classes. Most were basic: GED preparation, simple computer skills, job interview practice. She thought she was too smart for these classes, but she went anyway to break the monotony. The teacher, Ms. Harris, quickly noticed Miranda's education level. "Since you already have these skills," she said, "why don't you help the others?" At first, Miranda hesitated, but when she helped Denise, a young woman who couldn't read well, sound out words in a job application, something changed inside her. For the first time, Miranda used her advantages to help someone else, not just herself. By her 4th week, Miranda had established a routine. She woke up at 6 a.m., ate breakfast at 6:30, worked in the laundry from 8 to 4, attended classes from 5 to 7, and spent evenings talking with Tanya and other women. She learned their stories of poverty, bad choices, addiction, and bad luck. She learned that many were mothers who missed their children desperately. She learned that most had never had the chances she had taken for granted her entire life. "What will you do when you get out?" Tanya asked one night, 3 days before Miranda's release. Miranda lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know. My old life seems empty now. All I did was shop, party, and complain." "You could volunteer," Tanya suggested. "You're good at teaching. The literacy center always needs help." Miranda thought about this, the idea of helping others. It was new to her, but it felt right somehow. The night before her release, Miranda couldn't sleep. She would miss Tanya, Rosa, and even strict Ms. Harris. These women had shown her a different side of life, a reality she had been protected from by her family's money. "Don't forget us when you go back to your fancy life," Tanya said softly in the darkness. "I won't," Miranda promised. And for the first time in her life, she meant what she said. "I won't forget any of this." As Miranda lay awake, she realized something important. Judge Watson's sentence hadn't ruined her life. It had saved it. 6 months had passed since Miranda's release from county jail. The morning was cool and bright as she parked her small used car in the high school parking lot. She checked her watch, 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes early. Being on time was important to her now. Miranda grabbed her folder and walked toward the school building. She wore simple clothes, dark pants, a blue blouse, and comfortable shoes. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Good morning, Miss Caldwell," said the school secretary. They're ready for you in the auditorium. Thank you, Miranda replied with a genuine smile. The hallways were filled with teenagers hurrying to their first classes. Some glanced at Miranda curiously. A few recognized her from newspaper photos, but most just saw an ordinary woman carrying a folder. In the auditorium, about 200 students sat waiting. Their teacher, Mr. Phillips, stood at the microphone. Today we have a special guest for our safe driving assembly, he announced. Please welcome Miranda Caldwell. There was polite applause as Miranda took her place at the podium. She had done this talk many times now, at different schools across the city. It was part of her community service, but it had become much more than that. Hello, she began, her voice clear and confident. My name is Miranda Caldwell. 6 months ago, I was in jail. The students immediately paid attention. This wasn't going to be a boring safety lecture. I want to tell you about the day I thought I was above the law and how a judge showed me I was wrong. Miranda told her story simply, honestly. She described her entitled attitude, her drunk driving, her arrest. She showed them the actual news video of her behaving terribly toward Officer Rodriguez. Many students looked shocked to see how rude she had been. I thought my father's money and connections would save me, like they always had before, Miranda explained. I was wrong. Judge Watson sentenced me to 30 days in jail, and those 30 days changed my life forever. She described jail, not to scare them, but to show how her perspective had changed. She told them about Tanya and the other women she had met, about learning how privileged her life had been. One bad decision behind the wheel can destroy lives, Miranda said. Not just yours, but innocent people's too. I was lucky I didn't hurt anyone. Many drunk drivers aren't so lucky. A girl in the front row raised her hand. What happened after you got out? Did you go back to your rich life? Miranda shook her head. No, I couldn't go back to that life. It felt empty and meaningless. Instead, I started volunteering at the literacy center where my cellmate Tanya goes now. I help people prepare for job interviews and fill out applications. Another student asked, Do you still talk to your dad? We're working on our relationship, Miranda answered honestly. He was right to let me face the consequences of my actions. It was the best thing anyone ever did for me, even though I didn't see it that way at the time. As Miranda finished her talk, she noticed someone standing at the back of the auditorium. It was Officer Rodriguez in his uniform. Their eyes met, and he nodded slightly. After the assembly, Miranda approached him. Officer Rodriguez, I didn't expect to see you here. I visit schools for safety talks too, he explained. Your name was on the schedule today. I wanted to see how you were doing. Miranda smiled. I'm doing well. Better than before, actually. Thank you for arresting me that day. It sounds strange, but you saved my life. The officer looked surprised, then pleased. Just doing my job, Ms. Caldwell. The law applies to everyone equally. Yes, Miranda agreed. I understand that now. As Miranda walked back to her car, she felt a sense of peace. Her old life of privilege and entitlement was gone. In its place was something better, a life with purpose and meaning. That evening, Miranda visited the literacy center where Tanya was learning computer skills. Later, she would have dinner with her father, their third meeting since her release. Small steps toward a new relationship based on respect, not dependency. Miranda Caldwell was no longer above the law, and she was happier for it.